Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Issei was Saten and Harem with Tiamat Ophis and Ravel? Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support and follow the TaskFailer for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. Let's start this video. Most people love their parents. They raise you into the person you are and help you with every step you take, supporting you in every way they possibly can. Sadly, this is an image that doesn't fit into all families. While it is the natural thing for a parent to protect and help their child grow, nothing binds a parent to do such a thing. Children are abandoned by their parents at times, other times they are mistreated. One of those unlucky children was Issei. His father he had never even seen, but if he was anything like his mother, he didn't want to meet him anyway. Because his mother hated him. This situation thankfully only rarely occurs. Some parents might be neglectful or unloving, but it was very uncommon for a parent to hate their child when that child was no more than 5 years old. Issei was one of the few unlucky ones who went through this hell at such a young age. But there was a clear reason for why his mother acted like that towards him. Though it was no justification for what she was doing to the boy. Like children normally did, Issei resembled his father, and not just that, he also had taken some features from his grandfather. His goldish hazel eyes were sharp and focused. Every time his eyes met those of his mother, she was brought back into her own father's hands. Into the hands of a tormentor who would sell her body as he valued money far over her. The only reason she had been able to escape his grasp was that he just didn't care enough to spend money on getting her back. And that combined with Issei's short messy chocolate brown hair brought up just more bad memories. Memories of a man. A man who brought her life to a wonderful state. A man who seemed to care for her. A man she fell in love with. A man that would abandon her. Before Issei's birth, he disappeared. Left her behind, alone and with no one to hold on to. Her broken mind was not strong enough to handle the sorrow and anger. So she started taking medicine. But as she took more and more, its effects started disappearing and her need for it just started growing. The medicine died. And once Issei started looking like both his and her father's. She snapped. And from that day on, Issei turned into her punching bag, both literally and emotionally. On a good day, Issei would only be beaten once. On a bad day, he would lose count. In between those days of being beaten relentlessly, something happened. Something that would change Issei's future drastically and redefine the very essence of Issei's being. Yet compared to its massive implications, the event itself was rather tame. One day Issei stared out his open window. Any other person in his position may have been questioning if it wasn't a better idea to drop themselves out of it. But Issei, having nothing else to cling onto, had buried all his will into a single goal. Survive. Children form goals at young ages that might not stay for the long term, but those goals do help shape them in different ways. But with Issei, it was a dark corridor. There was a singular desire burning within him, a primal one that every being had within them. The need to live. His entire mind was set on that goal, his desires never diverging into different paths, as there never was a foundation for them to be built on. Survival was his drive. Survival was his need. Survival was his desire. He was utterly determined to survive, having devoted himself fully to the primal instinct. This unwavering and focused determination caught the attention of a being that was on a hunt for such a vessel. A vessel for his master to become full again. And that he found in Issei. As the young boy's window stood open, a white feather was blown towards him. He kept a watchful eye on it, not identifying it as a threat, but unwilling to ignore it. After all, what else should he be focusing on? As the feather made its way towards him, he took note of the faint glow coming from it. That glow made the feather seem more mysterious and magical than Issei fully acknowledged it to be. To be fair, he didn't even know of magic at this point, so assuming something to be magical was nothing he was accustomed to. Without a care in the world, he let the feather softly land in his hair and soon after decided to close the window to catch some sleep. Though to his surprise, when he reached for it, the feather seemed to have fully vanished. Looking around his small room, he could not find the tiniest sign of the glowing white feather, but eventually decided that it wasn't worth the effort of searching for it, as he had no particular use for it. He did not even consider that the feather had been no actual feather. It had been a physical manifestation of something far more powerful, making its way into his very core without making much of a fuss. Well, do not make a fuss while entering. Settling down was a process that didn't have to remain unnoticed by Issei. He was falling. Falling through the endless void of utter nothingness. In fact, he wasn't even sure if he was falling. There was no up or down, no left or right, no beginning or end. It was dark, but he could see himself. His arms hung upward as he fell head first. But as he moved them, he realized that they were illuminated from one side only. His head was even projecting a shadow onto his dot. There was light. His head flung back so he could see what was illuminating him. His eyes were met with a bright ball of light. He wasn't blinded by it, but as he kept staring, he took note of it spreading out through the void, sinking into the darkness, and seemingly burning it away, leaving behind a bright glow, almost indistinguishable from its core. It was powerful. His instinct screamed at him that this was not a threat, this was beyond what his mind could classify in terms of danger. Whatever it was, it could absolutely and completely erase him, turning him into a silent echo of the past that would instantly fade away from one's memory if heard. He was panicking. While his body remained unmoving, frozen in place from sheer shock, his mind was screaming in utter unfiltered fear. He wasn't scared for his life. He was scared of his existence. Balancing on the fine line of insanity, he stared straight at the manifestation of unstoppable doom as it slowly grew into the visibly infinite void. Issei's eyes shot open and not a moment later he had sat up in his bed, waves of sweat on his entire body, tears flooding his eyes, his skin feeling like it would jump off by the sheer number of shivers he was experiencing. Yet, even with the concentrated feeling of pure dread still lingering within him, he remained determined. No matter how impossible it had seemed in the moment, he had not surrendered his sanity to the entity that had invaded his dreams due to his unstoppable will. The mind that lost its sense would not be reliable for survival, so Issei refused to let go of those sparks of sanity within his head that were keeping him from completely giving up anything and everything. Having regained his full confidence, he lay back down and closed his eyes, not caring if he would come face to face with the light again. He had survived the encounter once. He would survive another one. Thankfully for Issei, the dream within the void would not come back to haunt him. For the next few months, his dreams remained empty, not showing any signs of the burning bright light. Meanwhile, the days went on as usual. He would get beat, and with every punch that fell, every fist that connected, his care for them started to dwindle more and more. It had become such an integral part of his life that he slowly started growing used to it. He just let it happen and would go on with his day as if there was no difference. This development was much to his advantage, as his mother had always found a reason for beating him within his emotion. And with him not displaying any, the beatings became less common, still occurring daily, but not as frequently as before. Then one day something would happen that would turn his entire life upside down. It was a normal day for Issei, but once the clock hit 8 p.m. it all stopped. There was a knock on the door. Silence was normal in the Haidu household, as the only two inhabitants didn't talk with one another, but only after the sound had reached Issei was it that the silence grew deafening, interrupted only by the door of his mother's room being opened and steps approaching the front door, from which the unusual sound had come from. Issei sat in the living room on the couch. He would have been staring out the window, but the knock had caught his attention. As the door opened, it felt like time itself slowed down. There stood a man. A tall man with a rather charming aura that was barely hiding the murderous air around him. His purplish eyes had a bitter coldness in them that, once Issei directly stared into them, seemingly caught him in a stranglehold, refusing to move away from him. A sense of dread grew within him. While this wasn't even close to the sheer fear he felt in front of the light, the man still gave off a sense of danger that Issei almost instantly took in. This feeling of danger increased when a devilish grin split the man's face. The moment was almost interrupted by his mother speaking with the man, but with the man keeping his eyes pinned on Issei, it was like his mother wasn't even there. Yet even with his entire focus being forced onto the man, he took note of the plastic bag that the man handed his mother, though once that small interaction was over, his focus was once again completely consumed by the cold eyes. The man took step after step closer to Issei, only stopping when he stood right in front of the young boy looking down at him sitting on the couch. "You'll get a month's worth supplied weekly for 2.5 years straight." Finally, their eye contact was broken, and the man looked at Issei's mother, who was visibly baffled by the words he had spoken. Though Issei didn't know the meaning behind them. "Oh really?" Her voice shook as a tear rolled down her cheek, something Issei got used to seeing, but not in this kind of tone. Because there was something so foreign in her voice. "Yes. A month's worth weekly, for one simple price. I'd give anything." Issei didn't really focus on what was being said, more on how it was being said. "Even the boy?" Issei's gaze shot towards the man, and he was met with a side glance quickly followed by the grin opening into a full smile. "Issei?" Her tone suggested that she hadn't even considered him as a price. What a nice name. But in contrast to many parents, it wasn't because he was priceless to her. "You can have him. Do whatever you want with him." It was because, in her mind, he wasn't worth anything. "Excellent." The next moment Issei was picked up by the man and put onto his shoulders. Some would say they looked like father and son, but truly Issei felt more like a hostage. "Then it's settled, one of my men will come by every week to give you what I promised." Issei just sat idly on the man's shoulders as he was carried out of his former home. He could have made it way harder for the man to take him away, but in the end, he was being distant from his mother, and while he wasn't sure what was to come with the man as his caretaker, in the moment it felt like taking that risk was easily worth it. As he finished his small train of thought, he was put down from the man's shoulders and put into the passenger seat of a simple-looking red car, and the man put on his seatbelt. The first minutes of driving remained silent as Issei stared around the car and from time to time outside to see the streets with people, houses, and all kinds of things he just wasn't used to seeing. Sold for some drugs. The sudden words from the man caught Issei's attention. You're taking it awfully well. Issei didn't answer, just staring at the man as he was concentrating on driving the car. Not the talkative one, are ya? No answer. Well, that's gonna make things easier, I think. Issei tilted his head in slight interest. Oh, trust me. Issei felt the same dreaded sense of danger as the man gave him another side glance with the same devilish smile caressing his features. If you play nice, it won't be painful. A shiver ran down the young boy's spine, and he decided that looking out the window again was way better than having a one-sided conversation with the man. Thankfully, the man didn't have anything else to say and let Issei stare out the window without any further comments. After a while, they reached a rundown motel, and the man parked in one of the few free spots. The man got out of the car, went around, and took him out of the passenger seat and back onto his shoulders. From his elevated point of view, Issei took in the location. The motel looked old and long abandoned. It was on the very outskirts of Kuo, the only thing between it and the forest was a hill with a church on top of it that also looked to be run down. There were barely any people around, and those that walked the streets looked very shady, kept their heads low, and made sure to have a big distance between themselves and the motel. But even though they didn't dare to step closer, most of them had their eyes on Issei, which made him very uncomfortable. To Issei's relief, they quickly entered the motel through the only not barricaded entry. A strong stench of alcohol hit Issei's nose. The place wasn't as rundown from the inside as it looked to be from the outside, but still, it didn't look like it was taken care of properly. They had entered what looked to be a lobby. It was a pretty open room, easily 10 meters in both length and width, with 2 couches on both walls to the right and left, with the left one covering the entire length of the wall, while the right one only went up to like 8 meters, so one could enter the half-open door at the far left corner of the room, from which Issei could hear some chattering. There was also a smaller counter in the middle of the wall opposite the entrance, with a woman looking to be in her 30s with long, sleek, almost grayish, but rather black hair and purplish eyes similar to those of the man. She gave the man a glance when he entered, quickly shifting her gaze towards Issei, visibly confused at his presence, before resuming her paperwork without as much as a word. There were 2 other doors on each side of the counter. Issei, still being on the man's shoulder, was brought through the door to the right of the counter, which led into a small room that was more like a cross path, with only 4 doors and a lamp inside. Each one on their own wall, including the one they had entered from. Issei barely got a look at that small room before the man opened the one straight ahead into a long hallway that had them take a left turn the moment they entered it, and had no real interesting features, being filled with a bunch of lockers lined up on the wall, with none of them being even slightly unique. At the end of this room, they made a 180 turn into a staircase, after which they had to turn right to go through another door. They entered another hallway. This one was different from the first one, as their point of entry was at a 90-degree turn. Issei had at most a second or two to look at the full hallway after the turn, as the man immediately barged into the same direction the stairs had led them. What Issei caught in the hallway after the turn was no different from the part they were walking along. One side of the wall was full of barricaded windows and a row of doors on the other wall, with it ending in one last door approximately right above the lobby-like area they had entered the building from. But before they reached said last door, the man turned to the last door before it and entered into a small room that looked to be a rather small bedroom for one person. There was a simple bed and a closet right next to it that, due to the small width of the room, was also touching the wall. Rest a bit. The man put Issei down from his shoulders onto the bed, tucking him in, which surprised Issei, who wasn't used to the motion. You'll be needing energy tomorrow. With that, the man left Issei in the small room. A few seconds later there was an audible click of the lock. Issei, deciding that following the man's orders was, for now, the best option, went to bed. He was falling through the same infinite void that seemingly stretched into nowhere and going far beyond. It took Issei a bit to recognize it, with the darkness consuming his vision. It was at first unclear if he truly was in darkness or if something was hindering his sight. His doubts were eliminated when he saw it. The light. It had grown. Somehow, in the span of the last few months, the light has taken an infinite part of the void and fused into it. For it to do something like that, the amount of time given was too insignificantly small. Not long enough for anything to grow that much. And even so, it was still visibly growing, expanding beyond anything the rules of reality should allow. The sensation of nearing doom hit Issei like a bus. The feeling was suffocating. It was like someone had put their hands around his throat, slowly tightening the hold until Issei could do nothing but agonizingly feel his body scream out for air. But they wouldn't stop there. Still closing in, even after Issei was nothing more than a dangling corpse. Only stopping after there was nothing left between those frightening fingers. It was unstoppable in that pursuit, and Issei could only hope that it would turn away from that idea and forget his infinitely smaller presence to move on to bigger fish. Yet it didn't. Its entire focus had been put onto Issei, and he felt it. If the light would have had eyes, there was no doubt in Issei's mind that he would be stared down by it. As if it was trying to burn him into its memory. Never to be forgotten. I am immortal. Like the last time Issei awoke in a cold sweat, feeling like he had just barely escaped certain death. Yet. He stayed determined. Even after knowing that a being of such power had put its focus upon him, he was willing to fight for his survival like there was nothing that could stop him. Ironically, it was exactly that attitude that had made this entity so interested in him. But even if Issei were to find that out, it would not stop him. He would still strive for survival with that unchangeable will of his. There was a knock on his door. Of course, this entity wasn't the only thing that seemingly had put its eyes on him. There was also a man. There was no time for Issei to do more than look towards it when the door swung open, revealing the man that had brought him here. "Good to see you're up." Issei didn't respond. "Let's get you something to eat first, then." That damned manic smile once more made its way onto the man's features, and Issei felt that same sense of danger coming from him. "Then we'll start." With those words the man stepped out of the small room, being quickly followed by Issei, who feared what was to occur if he were to anger the man in any kind of way. As he followed the man through the same path from which they had entered, Issei became more uneasy. He felt constantly watched, even with the man's back turned towards him. It was like traversing a deep cavern with a clear path, but no lights along the way, leaving you in utter darkness as you walk through the darkness, no knowledge of the actual direction you were heading, being pushed forward by only the fear that had been set into you from the moment you had found yourself here. While in the hallway with all the lockers, the man came to a sudden halt right before the door that led into the small intersection. "Oh. I forgot to mention." As his gaze once more met with Issei's, the young boy felt something he hadn't come to feel before when meeting the man's poisonous eyes. It felt like he was being hugged. Most people would appreciate such a feeling. But this wasn't the feeling of someone important closing their arms around you to show that they care for you. It was far from that warm comfort. It was more like the cold embrace of death. One arm slinging around his neck, the hand cupping his cheek, keeping him bound to where he stood, while the other hand was passing through his very skin, into his very being, stroking at his core, making him shudder in fear from the possibility of those soft and seemingly gentle strokes, turning into sudden claws at his soul, slowly breaking it apart until his mind couldn't handle it anymore. Shattering into millions of pieces, unable to be ever restored. "Consider yourself my son, you'll be treated as such." What? Issei took a moment to fully take in what the man had just said. What? No. He already had a father. At least that's what he had gathered from his mother's curses about the man. But. Was this his father? No. His mother wouldn't have remained so calm around him if that were to be the case. But then why? Why would this man take him in as a son? Why would he declare such a thing? Why would he want to be a father? Why? Why should Issei accept him as such? Closed off to the outside world, those questions echoed throughout Issei's head, never finding a satisfying answer. The next seconds, minutes, perhaps hours, remained but a blur within Issei's memory. Looking back, he could only catch flashes of being introduced to random people as the son of the man he had known for less than a full day. He remembered not speaking, putting off some of those people, but being spared from any repercussions thanks to his false title as son. He didn't even remember their faces. The blank gaps remained unfilled as he ate a meal of which quality he had never before consumed due to his mother's desire to only eat the cheapest meals possible. But even those faint recollections of what he could remember were all overshadowed by the ever-repeating questions that dominated his mind the entire time. Why? Perhaps he would have gotten an answer if he would have allowed his mind to take in what had been happening around him, but that didn't matter anymore. Now, son. His trance-like state of questioning was broken by the man's words. They tore into his mind, ripping his attention from all those circling questions. Issei's gaze slowly elevated from the ground and crawled up the man's body until their eyes met. "It's time." The sheer twisted excitement in those words made Issei recoil. As he stepped back, he took note of his surroundings, quickly realizing that he was in the crossroad-like room with the man holding the handle to one of those four doors, but with no orientation, Issei could not decide if it was one they had already gone through or one he was unfamiliar with. "Don't be shy." His silent question was answered when the man opened the door into a dark spiral staircase that was barely illuminated by the cheap lamp hanging from the crossroad-like room ceiling. The scent of death hit Issei's nose. And even though it was unfamiliar to him, his instincts immediately screamed out at the possibility of great danger presented to him. That in. There was a tiny shift in the man's voice. A tiny shift that made his voice step from barely hiding the darkness behind a mask to not even trying. A tiny shift that allowed the man to plant a fear deep within Issei. Without a shadow of hesitation, Issei started moving down the stairs, not daring to look back as the door was closed behind him. For a moment he prayed that the man had stayed outside and wouldn't even think of following after him, but to his despair, he soon heard footsteps following his own, as the both of them were swallowed by the darkness. It was a miracle that Issei's first steps didn't result in him falling down the staircase face first, as his eyes took quite a while to adjust to the unilluminated room, and only once they had reached another door was Issei fully trusting of his eyesight. As Issei stopped before the door, the footsteps of the man just came closer, making Issei doubt if it had been the right choice to stop here, but thankfully the man moved past him, taking something out of his pocket and unlocking the door. The dim light was enough to make Issei squint his eyes. But thanks to the lights being rather weak, it only took him a bit until he had fully adjusted to them. He was met with the sight of a hallway. But in contrast to the other hallways he had seen within the building, this one had a certain feeling of dread coming from each of the 9 doors that were lining the walls. Though before he could fully take it in, his eyes were caught by the 9th door at the very end of the hallway. Death Row. Someone had painted those words on that wall with some red paint. Or was it blood? Issei refused to think too much about them, yet the fear that was building up in his stomach would not allow him to take his eyes off those words. While Issei wasn't familiar with the term death row, he knew full well what death was and recognized it as one thing and one thing only. Failure. With his only goal and desire being that of survival, death was the thing that would mark the failure of reaching those goals. He had to stray away from it, keeping his distance and not allowing himself to fall into its cold embrace. Yet, he still followed the man as he approached the door. The door was opened by the man, who quickly stepped aside to present Issei with the insides of the room. At that very moment, Issei knew that staying with his mother would have been a better option, but he couldn't blame himself for that. After all, it wasn't him who had made the decision to leave that place. It would have been so much easier if the room would have been empty. But it wasn't. The chair was screwed to the middle of the small windowless prison. It was old and worn, but still in good enough shape that it could easily be used without fear of it breaking. It would have been better if it just ended at that. But it didn't. On that chair was a man. The man whose face was hidden behind a sack that had been pulled over his head, hiding his face from Issei. The man whose arms were restricted to the chair he was seated on with wires cutting off his blood flow to the point where his arms were a whole different color than the rest of his skin. The man whose legs were tied to the sturdy legs of the stool, making any movement beyond slight shifting impossible for his legs. He was sitting motionless, probably unconscious. Issei would have stared at the man on the chair much longer, paralyzed by the sheer fear of being in the exact same position, barely holding on to life with no way out. But that trance was interrupted by the man's sudden movement, resulting in Issei suddenly having a gun right in front of his face. Though it was not the barrel that was facing him. It was the grip. 10. One word. One word and Issei knew exactly what was demanded of him. He didn't even have to look at the man to know. 9. Yet, even so, he did. They met eyes and that creepy smile he had always worn when showing his sadistic glee towards Issei's fear had widened into a manic one. Those eyes. They demanded him to act. 8. And promised pain if their wish were to be denied. Issei's eyes could not stop themselves from traveling back to the man. 7. He was struggling. He had woken up and was struggling. Struggling to free himself from his inescapable position of death. 6. The pressure in those words increased. The demand for blood heightened. Issei reached for the gun. 5. The grip was cold as if death had put its cold hands upon it just before him. He could feel it. The power of this weapon in his hand. With the pull of a trigger. The life could be taken. 4. Feeling the ever-growing need for the victim's blood slowly leak into his own mind, Issei knew that hesitating was something he could not afford much longer. Pointing the gun at the victim's head he braced himself. 3. He had to survive. He had to survive. He had to survive. 2. You know the saying. The wounded beast is at its most dangerous. Well, there's a problem with it. The beast does not have to be wounded. While it still mostly applies to situations where the beast is wounded, there is no particular need for the beast to be wounded. After all, the two conditions that have to be met are very simple. The beast must be backed into a corner. And the beast must have a strong will. The will to survive, that is. Issei could do no more than stare. Stare at the man. Stare at his head. Stare at the hole. Stare at the blood. Death. That is what had occurred here. By his hand. Good work, son. Issei felt those words at their full impact. crashing into his empty head, forcing themselves into his memories. He wasn't crying. He wasn't laughing. He was standing and staring at a corpse, unsure how he should react. The clash had erupted within him. On one side he wanted to fall on his knees and beg for forgiveness from the soul that had probably already left them. Weep until he could no longer. Do what he had to repay for the life he had taken. But, on the other hand, he felt the need to smirk, if not even smile. Smile at the beauty of the art he had produced with the sheer pull of a trigger. Art that was never to be shown to anyone but him and his father. And he wanted more. Yet even with that massive divide going on within him, he still felt one thing remain burning deep inside of him, unchanging and unwilling to be challenged by either of those ideas. The need to survive. He had done what had to be done. If it were not for him taking action, he would have died just like the man in the chair had. There was no doubt about it. His action had been for the sake of his survival. It did not matter how the man had gotten himself on that chair. If he had committed a major crime or if he had been kidnapped for the sick amusement of someone else. If it weren't for his death, Issei would have had to face his own. And Issei wouldn't allow that. With his determination flaring back up, he suppressed the battle within him and walked from the scene. This was beyond his problems anymore. He had done what he had to survive. The only thing important was what came next, not what had already happened. He wanted to cry. He wanted to desperately break down in tears and let all the sorrow crash down upon him. Yet at the same time, he wanted to break. He wanted to crush everything in his path, leaving behind nothing but broken skulls and the wonderful smell of fresh blood. This internal conflict was one that had found its origins in that very first kill. In that bullet that pierced through some guy's head. In the blood that had painted the walls. It never had a chance to come to a conclusion, not once, building itself up in the back of his mind while his uncaring need for survival pushed him forward. Perhaps it would have faded away already if it weren't for the constant fuel provided to it. Almost on a daily basis, Issei would pull the trigger to murder someone. It was the only requirement he had to fulfill. As long as he would kill when commanded to do so, there were no consequences, no negative side to all the spilled blood that his hands were soaked in. At least, none outside his mindscape. Within his head, he had begun tearing himself apart, two sides fighting for what they called right and wrong, trying to win dominance within him, while he was driven by his unchanging determination to survive. At first, it was but two ideas going in different directions with Issei having the possibility to choose either. And instead of taking one of the crossroads presented to him, he had just stopped, letting those conceptual ideas grow through the questioning of his actions until there was no room for anything else in his head. The only other thought remaining was his drive for survival that both ideas agreed with, leaving it untouched as it remained prominent. And so it began that after a few years that felt like decades, he had no thoughts within himself. He didn't ask questions. He didn't answer any. He just did what was demanded of him in exchange for his survival. This was not a perfect strategy. After all, that conflict would just grow and grow until the dam holding it back would be shattered. But for now, it was the only option. So he did his best holding that dam up. Almost every day he was brought into that underground area. He would be handed a gun. He would see someone bound to the chair. Sometimes struggling. Sometimes silently accepting. And he would taint the walls in a fresh new layer. They all fused into a blur. Person after person. There was no mercy. No questioning. No hesitation. Only death. And he delivered it. But after that the circle had repeated over and over and over again. It stopped. On one very special day. Shit, we really don't have anyone to go as a bodyguard, do we now? Around 75% are on outposts, defending the territory. 20% are directly in the base guarding. And the remaining 5 are resting. There isn't anywhere we can pull forces from without destabilizing our defenses or giving up an entire outpost. Issei wasn't listening, sitting on one of the tables in the bar area of the motel, eating whatever it was that had been put on his plate. It fed him well enough, so he didn't question what exactly it was. He didn't take note of how the conversing group had put their eyes on him, all with the same thought. You can't do that. Why not? He's a young child at best, a deadbeat one at that. He is gonna serve you as a bodyguard if he doesn't like to do anything. A chuckle came from the man. Don't you underestimate my son like that. For a few seconds, that felt like hours for the woman spoken to, there was utter silence, except for Issei's cutlery. He wasn't being spoken to. Trust me. The man's eyes caught those of Issei, immediately catching the boy's attention. He knows how to protect someone. Issei couldn't decipher a command in those words, and so decided that doing nothing was the best option. You'll be my bodyguard, son. As soon as those words fell, Issei stood up from his seat and walked up, next to the man. The man's demands were clear, and he would not fail him. Why did you bring the child with you? Issei looked the woman that stood in front of the man right in the eye. It was the same woman who had been at the counter that day he had entered the motel for the first time. Her eyes the exact same shade as those of the man. Issei didn't remember her. He was ready to kill her at any given moment. "Don't worry, he is my son." The woman's eyes wandered from Issei to the man, who had at least 5 guns pointed at him, probably waiting, just like Issei, for a signal to kill. Why? Let's just say he is a gem in a mountain of rusting copper. The woman took another look at Issei before shaking her head and turning her attention back to the man once more. "If you say so anyway, let's get down to business." Those words brought a tension in the air that made Issei shift position slightly, feeling a predatory aura radiating from both the woman and man, readying himself to do whatever he must to survive. "As you wish." The man extended his arm and without a speck of hesitation, the woman reached for it. As their skin touched, they shared a sharp inhale before releasing their hold, nodding to one another and parting ways by walking in opposite directions. "Kill her." Before anyone could react, a gunshot echoed through the air and a hole appeared in the woman's head. Blood flew across the room and accumulated on a puddle under her as she fell face first. You would expect there to come more after. For the man to be filled with bullets. For the room to turn into a battlefield. But it did not. The man left with Issei following, no one even trying to stop them. "I know you barely remember anybody you kill." Issei's immediately shot up to meet those of the man as he spoke those words. "But did you notice that you killed her?" Issei remained silent. He had no answer for the man. Kinda funny really. A small chuckle escaped the man's dot. "Killing your own mother and not even noticing it." At that moment something happened. Issei, upon hearing those words, for the first time in years, fully took in the information laid out to him. Those words. They reached his very core. The very center of his being. And they resonated with it. He was killed. His mother. His former tormentor. All with his own hands. His fingers were dipped in her blood. And for the very first time, he felt something bubbling within him. A sense of satisfaction and fulfillment. A sense of happiness. At that very moment, Issei, for the first time ever, smiled. But with that sudden rush of happiness, with that change in feelings. The dam. It cracked. And in that very moment of vulnerability. It was broken. Before him, there were 2 roads. One of redemption. One of damnation. He had no problem choosing. After all, it was death that had brought him happiness. The man had expected the usual. The silent response of no meaning that wasn't even spoken to him. No hum, no words, no nothing. He had certainly not expected a bullet to shoot through his head. The fool. Before he could finish his sentence another one was shot, splitting his jaw in 2, making it impossible for him to speak. Without much more thought, he turned to the boy in a motion to swing at him. But what stood before him was no boy he had called son. Before him there stood a blood-soaked beast, hungry for his flesh, ready to tear him into pieces for the tiniest bit of his blood. It had only 2 goals. Survive. And kill. He wouldn't let it. His swing was aimed at the boy's head, with the intention of ending this as early as possible, but before his arm connected another bullet pierced it, slowing its momentum and changing the direction so that it hit Issei's stomach rather than his head. But even so, the swing was devastating. Issei was flung across the street, rocketing through the wall of an abandoned building. The man immediately started regenerating and quickly took note of 3 onlookers, watching in horror. Not wanting his inhuman nature to be revealed, he swung his hand in their general direction, fingers detaching from his hand and rocketing off at absurd speeds. Before any of them could as much as comprehend what had just happened, they were all pierced through various parts of the body. Their deaths were no different than if caused by a gunshot. Thinking the situation was over, the man sighed and started heading back on his own. There were no remaining onlookers, and Issei was. There was a spark. Immediately he froze in his steps. His eyes were wide open. The fire lit up in the darkness. He turned around, back to the house, and there. Right there, where the dust had settled, stood a familiar figure. The fire spread. Issei stood there, seemingly immovable by anything that was not his command. Consuming everything in its path. Oh. The man took 2 steps back, but couldn't make it much farther, as the pressure on his body seized any movement he could make. Nothing would stop it. No, no, no. You weren't supposed to awaken it yet. The panic in his eyes could not be hidden from Issei, but it didn't matter. Nothing could stop it. Issei would kill him either way. Something emerged from the flames. In a last-ditch effort of survival, the man took all he got to stand against the pressure and went straight for Issei. He wouldn't let himself get killed that easily. It stood. Rushing at the boy he used to call son, his arm turns into a ginormous accumulation of flesh, swinging at the still-standing menace that Issei had become from one moment to another. Watching the flames consume the darkness that once held it in place. As his massive hand was to hit Issei, it started melting. The mass of flesh evaporated before it could touch Issei, leaving only a burning stump from which white fire was quickly crawling up onto the shoulder. In a state of panic, the man ripped off the stump to try and stop the flames from entirely consuming him, but before he could do much more, his eyes met those of Issei. The creature revealed its wings. He wasn't standing where he had been before anymore. He was right in front of the man. One of his arms, made out of pure white flames, came at the man in an uppercut-style fashion. Before it could touch his stomach, the man felt insane pain as anything within 5 centimeters around the fist was completely destroyed. Burned beyond a crisp. Evaporated into nothingness. And it took off. It didn't stop. Tunneling through his entire body until reaching his skull. Before any cell of his body could react to make a new body for his consciousness, they were burned by those same white flames, leaving his soul wide open, and within moments, he already felt the sweet embrace of death. And with nothing to hold him to the world beyond its grasp, he was dragged down into the abyss. Issei looked down at where the man had stood. Not even ashes remained. No tiny mountain of dust. No crackling sparks of remaining flesh. No smoke cloaking the air. Nothing. He was gone for good. I must say. I am impressed. Immediately Issei spun around, coming face to face with a pale man. The man's dark blue hair was tied to a ponytail, and his warm cyan eye carried a certain fire in them that he had only just witnessed within his own flames. Don't worry. I am everything but a danger to you. Even though Issei had never seen this person before, he felt a certain sense of familiarity from his voice and could not help but feel unthreatened by him. You can call me Dante. And if I can help you with one thing, then it's surviving in this world. Those words caught Issei's attention. Now first, let's get away from here. Without much hesitation, he headed towards the forest surrounding Kuo. After all, a place where demons feast is no place for a phoenix. Issei just followed the man. He didn't know what to expect from him. But he knew it was better than what he had behind himself. Issei could not stop himself from taking in the beauty of the evening forest he was in for the first time. While most would find this experience to be a wonderful show of nature's beauty in its own right, Issei had just tapped into a supernatural part within himself he had not known of before. He could feel the natural energy of the environment in the air, gently laying upon him, undisturbed and balanced out by itself. He caught the occasional sound of birds chirping all around, and there was the constant calm rustling of the wind in the tree leaves. Closing his eyes, he could feel the terrain under his feet, hard and solid, yet ever-changing. With every breath he took, his lung felt freshened by the forest air. Opening his eyes again, he took note of small strings of light flowing all around the area, fading in and out of his sight as they idly floated around the forest atmosphere, softly coiling around trees and bushes, moving within them, and traveling calmly through the air. It was almost natural to him that what he was looking at was indeed the forest's magical energy that was held within all the plants that were scattered all across. Soon he took note that those same strings of magic were encircling him, as if the forest itself was observing his organic body and viewing it as another part of nature. He could feel the magic enter his lungs with each of his breaths, and as he grew curious, he attempted to feel more of that calming energy. A mistake, as he came to find out. Under all that soft, comforting feeling of freedom and nature lay something deep within the very core of every plant. Every living non-sentient being within the forest. As the unspoken circle of life went, plants were at the bottom of the food chain, unable to act as all kinds of creates ate from them, trampled on them, destroyed them. It was a simple yet horrific life to be part of, as they were powerless, not even capable of watching as even their strongest brethren fell to the hands of creatures far above on the food chain. Their defenses were reduced to poison and thorns, but they could do nothing to actively defend themselves against any threats. This one-sided unfairness developed something within the plants, something that only sentient beings should have been capable of developing. But without a mind to withhold it, it became so potent and raw that it would drive one mad if they were to attempt to tap into it. Hate. Utter hate for all sentience. But without a mind to direct that hate, it just became something lingering deep within every forest, every plant, every being that had not grasped sentience. And so, it lashed out. At anyone that attempted to step within the realm of any forest's energy. It did not matter who it was, why they did so and how they did it. All that mattered was that they were within reach of the sheer brutality of the hate that would pound at them without any sense of mercy, any sense of reason, or any sense at all. After all, they didn't judge, didn't question, nor did they act. The plants only hated as more they could not do. Issei in his unknowing naivety tapped into exactly that hate, and before he could as much as fathom the sudden change in feeling that the forest was giving him, his already broken mind was crushed under the hate of all those plants that lay within its reach. To his luck, Dante had been there to pull him out before he could be drawn insane once more. Don't be fooled by the surface of an ocean you haven't explored. Issei, still in a trance-like state of shock, didn't pick up upon those words, and Dante took note of that but decided against repeating himself later down the line, as the experience would have most probably already instilled such a lesson upon him. Even outside of the plant's hate, he still felt the dread of such unrivaled hatred being tossed upon his fragile mind. The only positive coming from it was that the storm within his mindscape between blood and peace had been frozen, completely overtaken by the need for survival, drastically overreacting as the hate had lashed out. He could easily consider himself lucky to be one of the few people to step into the rage without preparation and to come out still functionally sane, but he did no such thing. After all, those dreadful moments of panic had just deepened the scars deep within his mind, tearing them freshly open and allowing some insanity to drip into his system. As he slowly filtered most of the insanity out of his conscience, he promised himself to not trust while taking a risk in doing so. Why should one open new doors if they could lead into a dark abyss to which an exit was but a foreign memory? With that fresh thought, he turned to Dante to immediately question why this man was such a hard exception to that very rule he had established not just now, but ages ago. Why he would allow himself to rely on the man's word, even if betrayal by him could mean death. The answer lay in Dante's eyes. They were not two strangers randomly stumbling upon one another. They were not master and student who had just decided upon titling each other such. They were not people with a history that mirrored the other ones, understanding one another in a way no one else could fathom. No, they were something entirely different. In those cyan eyes, Issei found chains. Chains leading back to Issei's hands. If there was no desire for his presence, Dante could do no more than comply. They were linked in a way that Issei wasn't fully able to grasp, yet he could feel that the bond had been there for years, even before his own birth. Dante's life was fully dependent on Issei. If it was Issei's wish, Dante would do as he was asked. From throwing himself down a cliff to torturing himself. There were no limits to what Issei could make him do, and both of them knew that. But while Dante was fully reliant on Issei's acceptance of his presence, Issei wasn't able to just let him go to be forgotten. Dante was a lifeline. He was the only connection Issei had to this new world he had never known of before and his only means of finding out about it. If he were to let Dante go at this very moment, he would be lost. Lost in a world that he knew nothing about and could do nothing with, only able to watch as it moved beyond his reach. Finally, he stopped looking into Dante's eyes only to look at him. They weren't friends. That much was clear. But they were reliant on one another and thus bound to put their trust in each other's arms. They were bound without a way or wish to be disconnected. Exactly. Issei was not surprised by those words. He knew that Dante had seen the same in his eyes if he hadn't known of this before. This might surprise you, but it was you that offered the bond. That very instant Issei vigorously scoured through his memories, trying to find a point where he had done anything remotely close to something he might consider a bonding ritual. He doubted having done so as a baby, nor did he remember a waking moment within his time with his mother where he could have acted in a way to insinuate such a bond. The time with the man who had wished to be called father by him was too broken and scattered for him to fully exclude it, yet he didn't believe he would have even been able to do anything like that while under the man's supervision. Was this one of his victims that had miraculously somehow bound themselves to him in their dying moments? No, Dante had said that it was Issei who had offered the bound and he couldn't bring himself to doubt the man's word. Quickly he took note of Dante softly shaking his head, telling him that he would not find anything within his memories. As of right now you won't be able to remember the events. They occurred before even your parents were alive. This piqued Issei's interest, as it seemed impossible for such words to be of truth, yet, like before, he felt inclined to believe Dante's every word. It happened in the time shortly after I had traversed hell without losing my humanity. The sentence alone unsettled Issei, but he did not question it. An avatar of death came to me, interested in my capabilities of surviving such things without being scared or even changed by them. He paused for a second, regret unmistakably forming in his eyes as the memories of what transpired came freshly back to him. I foolishly accepted, thinking that if I were to work under death, that mortality would be a problem of the past for me. He let out a sigh. In an attempt to perhaps test me, perhaps just torture me, they send me on a mission to do the impossible. Silence took over and Dante didn't attempt to hide his frustration or regret in any way, visibly slumping as he held his head in what Issei could only describe as a display of shame. But Dante had no intention of making Issei wait much longer, so he continued. I was tasked with killing an immortal. Dante gave Issei another moment to fully internalize the paradox of the statement, yet Issei did not seem the tiniest bit shaken by such words. Of course, I wasn't able to accomplish such a task, but knowing fully well that refusing death was no option, I still attempted to at least come back with something to satisfy its demands. The darkness within his cyan eyes clearly showed that there would have been nothing for him to bring back. I was lucky though, after all, it was you, the Phoenix, whom I was supposed to kill. Issei didn't understand, but he didn't show his lack of awareness, staying stoic and without losing the tiniest of words. You, seeing me strive to achieve an impossible goal, took pity on my soul, as I was a being that was trapped in an ever-narrowing pathway as either way would lead to my doom. So, you opened me a door I hadn't even considered existing. Listening to how moved Dante was, Issei could not describe what he felt within himself. A very foreign yet familiar sense of accomplishment. Of succeeding at something. Yet he could not attribute it to himself, it felt too distant to truly stem from his own hands, and so he dismissed it for being just something transmitted to him via the bond he shared with Dante. You took me under your wing. Promising me protection if I were to serve you as I served death, loyal, unwavering, and determined to never give up. Looking unimpressed as always, Issei stared at Dante without as much as a blink. He had gained nothing from hearing that other than a few bits and pieces of information that as of right now were to no use for him. Now, that was my story, yours is a bit simpler. Not even raising an eyebrow, Issei continued looking at Dante with his cold dead eyes. Information was what he wanted, so he would do what he had done many times before. He listened. You are not the same Phoenix I was tasked to attack all those decades ago. You are a soul selected by the Phoenix to be not its vessel, but to become one with it. If you were to refuse that position, that part of the Phoenix attached to you would break itself off from your soul without a care in the world, leaving you to probably fall into death's hands, as the process would most likely result in your demise. Issei knew that this option to part ways with whatever the Phoenix was no free choice as presented to him. It was an illusion of such, to possibly lure him into a sense of security. Not as if it were needed. After all, Issei had not even considered letting go of whatever had allowed him to survive his confrontation with the man who called him son. Without it, he would be dead. Without it, he would have failed. It had been a rather weird experience to escape the grasp of death so narrowly. One he did not wish to repeat. He regretted it. He regretted falling prey to his own foolish emotions in a sudden spike that he had been unable to control. In the moment it had seemed like the best idea he ever had. Just kill the man that was holding you now and here, no one would come to immediately avenge him. And while it wasn't a solution that promised to be good in the long term, he could not stop himself from seeing anything but the short-term pros of the act. So he acted. Within seconds of the man's words reaching him, he had already pulled his gun and was aiming where he always aimed. The head. It was a simple kill shot, and it should have been effective against any human it was used against. But when no blood painted the streets red, no brain matter splattered across the pavement, no broken fragments flew across the soil, he panicked and shot once more, a bit further down, but still in a kill shot area. He barely got a glimpse of the first hole closing up as whatever was standing in front of him turned in a clearly offensive stance. Ready to pummel him with a force that was probably unrivaled by any man. Moved by nothing more than instinct, he fired another shot, miraculously hitting the arm quickly approaching, and even though there was a moment of celebration as he clearly hit the approaching attack, that short burst of joy was quickly pummeled by the crushing feeling of his entire stomach area being destroyed. He knew that it had been the same fist, and he knew that there was no way for him to recover from that blow. His stomach felt like it was nothing more than a memory of a functioning organ. He would probably have thrown up if it weren't for his spine that felt like it had been turned into dust. Before his brain could even fully register the amount of pain that came from the inhuman punch, his head met a wall and went straight through it, but not without being accompanied by multiple cracking sounds. Perhaps he would have screamed, perhaps he would have cried, perhaps he would have passed out. But feeling death quickly approaching with a hunger for his soul, something within Issei snapped. It had been his fault. His fault that this had occurred. His fault that he lay upon death's throne. His fault that he would fail his one and only goal. Would he allow such? No. Even with all hope gone. Even with his body on the brink of breaking. Even with his mind already falling into the cold and deathly embrace of unconsciousness. Issei kept on fighting. He had one goal. One desire. And he didn't care what or who would stand in his path to achieving his one and only true strive. Survive. Death may grasp him by the throat until air would never touch his lungs again. He would keep breathing. Life could shatter his legs to the point where there weren't even memories of what once was under his torso. He would keep walking. Destiny could twist his path in ways where every second upon it promised pain and delivered tenfold, giving him hell every moment that his cells were capable of feeling. He would keep going. Truly he was unstoppable, and if not in body, he was so in spirit. In those last moments of his mortal life, something deep within him reached out toward him. A promise. The promise of a body that could withstand whatever was thrown upon it as long as he could endure the pain. There was no hesitation in his decision. The light took him. There was a spark. His body ignited in flames white like the sun's very core, shining bright enough to illuminate every fiber of his being. Gone was his body once they appeared, but that very second, new bones formed within the flames. The frame was built upon which flesh sprouted, covering the skeletal fundament entirely before skin stretched itself over it. Issei was unstoppable at that very moment. And his tormentor was the one to feel the very wrath of such an unkillable being. Issei knew well that those very moments were what allowed him to be standing here now, but looking back on them was still no easy thing to do. No one could stare such close failure in the eye without feeling a sense of dread that it might get even closer next time. There wouldn't be a next time, he knew that much. But the sheer idea that this world might allow a way for someone to bring forth such a next time was no potential threat he dare ignore. Because if death had been one step closer, there would have been no flames. He would have ended a mangled corpse that was thrown through a wall and no more. And no matter how much he tried. It terrified him. "Are you alright?" Issei snapped out of his trance-like meditative state and returned his attention towards Dante. For the pale man, the difference was minimal. Issei just focused on him again, instead of staring off into the distance. Taking a deep breath, Dante mentally prepared himself for what was to come. This was no regular human that had been chosen as a vessel. This was someone acting less like a living being and more like a mechanical one. It had never happened before that a human being was declared such a vessel, as they normally weren't driven enough or their determination lay scattered instead of focused, making them an unreliable foundation for the Phoenix's powers to prosper. Thus simpler-minded beings were chosen for such a task, but often this would lead to only short circles, as most of those simplistic-driven minds gave up in their prior unshakable quest for survival after they had guaranteed themselves offspring. Some of the more ironic passings were creatures accepting their death as if immortality had not been in their grasp, just too blind to see the light that would bring them so much else unreachable joy. But in those cases, Dante could do nothing to help those creatures learn. He would watch and guard them from afar, knowing well that without him hiding their presence, they would be targeted by a lot of factions. If he were the one who got to decide the next vessels, there would have been a lot more human subjects, even if just for experimentation, as he would at least like to see what a being of intent and true consciousness would do with the powers of such a magnificent entity. Maybe even a truly suitable vessel would be found in one of them. In the end, he got his wishes, just in the worst way possible. Instead of a bright person with wonderful ideas sprouting from their head every next second, he got to deal with a boy as empty as the dead shell some of the insects left behind that had the honor of carrying the title Phoenix for the short circles that they had allowed their life to have. But ultimately it did not matter. After all, he didn't have the slightest say when it came to the choices of his master. And if that master wished for another 1,000 ants to be his vessels, so be it. It wasn't like he could speak out his mind or anything akin to that. He had sacrificed his right to an opinion the day he had shaken hands with death. Perhaps he had a right to argue for the redemption of his soul, but in the end, there was no one to pray to for such freedom. There was only him and his master, who he had given his life to in an act of survival. It was but his fault, so he would not act as if he was in any position to complain about it. He would take his punishment. Without complaining. Without wavering. Without stopping. He would stand aside the Phoenix and choke his regrets out until they were no more than shallow thoughts, deeply buried within the shadows of his mind. At least that was the case. Years ago when the Phoenix had been what he was when they first met. After thousands of circles, those buried regrets were slowly crawling their way back into the spotlight, and he knew fighting against them would just propel them, so he did nothing but ignore them. A raindrop hit his face, snapping him out of his own thoughts, and immediately he put his entire attention on Issei, the boy who had been chosen as the vessel. As you have most likely noticed by now, your flesh is not what it once was. He had gotten used to not getting responses to whatever he said, but now that someone was around, he had automatically expected for that standard to be shaken up, thus Dante was completely unprepared for the utter silence Issei was offering him. You see, your bones are no longer needed, your organs no longer at work. Humanity is something of your past and trying to take a step back towards it is but a step back into vulnerability. As the cool rain set in, Dante took note of the fact that his speech was borderline useless. Issei had already stopped breathing. His heart had gone quiet. His body was dead. You've ascended beyond the border of mortality into the realm of immortality. While not yet indestructible, your body will come back from anything as long as your mind sets out for exactly that to happen. Your body isn't even restricted to the human form anymore. You can change and twist yourself to any shape you require without the fear of any consequences from within yourself. This was one of the many reasons Dante had hoped for a human to take on the mantle, as they would have thousands of ideas for what they would change into, letting their mind run rampant as they tapped into such potentially wild powers. But Issei didn't. If he already was ever regenerating, what purpose did morphing his body have to increase his survivability? If anything, it would be lowered. After all, if a being that could slay immortals witnessed him in an unnatural state of matter, it would be a question of only time until he'd be chosen as the creature's target and murdered. Avoiding even the chance of something like that happening was best for his general survivability. Suddenly there was a spike in the atmosphere. A small visible shockwave shook the forest greenery, dispersed the rain clouds, and made all life within proximity immediately flee in various directions. Something crackled in the air, completely overpowering the natural flow of energy within the forest itself, creating a concentrated spot of pure magic, seemingly appearing out of nowhere. While some of it leaked outward making the air around them crackle, the larger portion of it formed into something, slowly taking shape until the clear image of a gateway had formed in the midst of the forest. Issei was already stepping away from it when Dante put himself between the gate and him, reaching into the air beside him as white flames, indistinguishable from his own, appeared and formed into a long staff that Dante caught before it could fall to the ground. Within moments of making contact with his hand, the staff lit up in cyan runes, reminiscent of Dante's eyes, and a blade of the same color formed at one of the staff's ends. It was a scythe. The scythe that radiated death. One that would easily strike down anyone unprepared for it. This was no harvesting tool. This was a weapon designed to bring death upon its victims. But even with that knowledge, Issei was not scared away by the sudden appearance of the blade. Greatly contrasting what he would normally feel upon seeing such a weapon in such proximity to himself, he felt safe, knowing that he was protected by something of that caliber. But all those feelings of being secure shattered upon a presence appearing within the gates. The pressure was not comparable to what he felt during his confrontations with the light, but this was not a dream. Here his entire body got to feel the tensity, not just his mind. And while some would argue that pressure only on the soul was more devastating, the feeling of such pressure being put upon his body was something that Issei was unfamiliar with. Having the feeling of potentially being ripped apart was nothing when put beside the feeling of potentially vanishing in such an absolute sense that not even memories of yourself could remain. But Issei was not prepared for it, thus he froze when faced with it. Out of the gate came a feminine humanoid. Issei could not convince himself that such a being could be human. Her iris was as blue as a sapphire, shining with energy. Her long blue hair was blown behind her as it let itself be carried by the energy dispersing after the gate vanished behind her. She wore simple clothes, but even though her shirt was a size or two too big, there was no hiding her muscular build. After the gate fully vanished, the air around her didn't stop crackling, a clear indication that she had been the one to bring it forth. Issei caught Dante's position stiffen as her eyes seemingly met his, but Issei from his position could not see if they were truly exchanging looks or just observing one another as potential threats or enemies. What he did not see coming was her gaze crashing into his. He was used to staring into the darkness within one's eyes. After all, a large portion of his life was besides a man who did exactly that. Stare into him with that certain darkness that was impossible to look back at without feeling one's own mind slipping into said darkness. But this was different. This was like meeting eyes with a predator. He felt held captive by those glowing blue lights that seemingly shone brighter as the setting sun that was slowly disappearing from the corners of his vision. They were like chains piercing into his flesh and pulling him closer to a hungering beast's maw. He feared them and wished nothing but to create distance between himself and them, but he could not move as they seemingly penetrated through his eyes, staring right into his very being. Dante, noticing the shift in focus away from himself and onto Issei, stepped between them breaking their eye contact, allowing Issei to blink in confusion as he witnessed the sun disappearing completely and the sky slowly growing darker from the purplish color it had taken on. But even though it was his first time witnessing such an event in years, he could not care less about it at the moment. Oryo. Dante could not finish his sentence as he was promptly hit by something that felt akin to a superpowered truck hitting his chin and launching him upwards, creating a small shockwave that made the trees around them bend away from it. Issei quickly lost sight of him as the trees bent back into their original position, blocking almost all sight of the sky through their thick layers of leaves. Quickly he noted that spotting Dante in the sky would do nothing to aid him in his survival, thus he did the next best thing that came to his mind. Run away. Knowing full well what staring into those sapphire eyes would do to him, he didn't even look towards the thread that was the being behind him and decided to make a mad dash for it. But before his eyes could fully focus on what was in front of him, a blur appeared and a moment later the same humanoid stood before him. But even with her sudden appearance, Issei managed to avoid eye contact, turning his body around and trying to run in another direction. Unsurprisingly, the humanoid once more appeared within his line of sight. Issei quickly realized that she possessed some kind of super speed, which also explained how she had been able to dispose of Dante without him even being able to react in any kind of manner. Knowing that she would appear in front of him if he were to look in any direction, he decided to turn his side upward, but still somewhat forward, so he could see the trees and avoid bumping into them, but also be able to stop himself from establishing eye contact with the humanoid. The plan failed within moments as the humanoid just appeared, standing on a branch with ease. So Issei naturally did the polar opposite of that idea. He faced the ground at a slightly angled view, where he could still see the trees in front of him, if barely. At first, that strategy seemingly worked out flawlessly as he ran through the forest terrain. That was until he hit something. It felt like hitting a brick wall that was oddly enough not that hard, just extremely stable and immovable, but to his surprise not painful. Still, he stumbled back from the impact only to realize that it had been the humanoid he had run into, and the next moment he was pinned to the ground, a tight grasp around both of his wrists. But once again, he was surprised by how painless it was. One would think that a head trauma would be unavoidable after being flung at the ground with such force and speed, but he barely felt anything when making contact with the rough forest ground, even though he was tightly pinned down against it. But before he could think much more about how unusual that all was, his eyes were captured by the sapphire blue ones, which were now all up in his face and unavoidable. Closing his eyes and not opening them might have been the solution, but now he was already trapped within their grasp, and blinking was an option out of reach for him. He had a hard time grasping what was happening while he was being pinned down. Issei honestly didn't even know why he was still being pinned down. Perhaps his capturer didn't trust into the paralyzing effect that her gaze had on him. Oddly enough, with every second that passed, the gaze of the humanoid started feeling less like the gaze of a predator, but more like just an observer, something watching him with curiosity. And while it did not ease his nerves about the humanoid above him, he at least didn't feel endangered as much as he did before. He couldn't get a chance to try and understand why that change was happening before the moment was interrupted, this time by the humanoid flicking her head to her side and catching a blade with her teeth. A scythe. Before Issei could fully take in what had happened, she turned her face back to him, the scythe still in mouth, pulling a surprised Dante over her back. In an attempt to counter the humiliating move, Dante took the momentum from being flung over the humanoid's back and attempted to pull her off Issei. Somewhat unsurprisingly, this resulted in absolute failure, as she did not as much as budge at his notion. There was a moment of nothing, where neither party moved. But it was promptly interrupted by the humanoid rising from where she was, barely above Issei, who just then noticed how truly close she had been to him. While doing so, she didn't even consider letting go of the glowing blade between her teeth, forcing Dante to twist himself uncomfortably. Standing at her full height, Issei noted that she was clearly half a head taller than Dante, which was rather impressive for Dante was from what Issei had seen a bit taller than the average man. As her gaze turned once more towards the man wielding a scythe, he still clutched the weapon in his arms, having adjusted his position. "What do you want?" Dante's words were spoken through gritted teeth. It was clear that he would have rather rammed his scythe through the humanoid's skull, killing her in an instant. But seeing that it was outside of his abilities to seemingly inflict any kind of damage upon her, he tried his hands at talking once more, seeing it as the only reasonable remaining option. The silence that came was felt upon all of the three, and even though Issei could have attempted escaping from under the humanoid, as he was no longer pinned down by its body or eyes, he decided to remain still, fearing that such action would reignite the prior sequence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spat out the blade of the scythe. Dante stopped himself from attempting to ram it into her skull once more and lowered it so that it was non-threatening, but remained ready for him to use. "You should be dead." Her voice, not unlike herself, radiated power and dominance. The tone was more than enough to decipher that she was unhappy about Dante's survival. "Why aren't you?" In a moment of hesitation, Dante weighed his options, not sure how much information he wanted to give the powerful being. "There is only one entity that can erase me from the face of this planet, and he lays before you." She narrowed her eyes, seemingly trying to figure out what exactly he meant by those words, but Dante did not miss the spark of positive confusion when he didn't speak up against her or arrogantly demand his question be answered first. He knew his place in the situation. "Let's start this entire interaction anew. I miscalculated what would occur here." Dante was confused by the statement, but Issei immediately took this as a sign that he could stand up again. The humanoid took a few steps back, which made Dante reposition beside Issei as he let his scythe be consumed by the same white flames that had made it appear in the first place. Once again, silence took over the scene as both sides waited for the other to act. In the end, it was the humanoid who spoke first. "To start this off, who are you two?" "We are but a servant and his master, having just escaped imprisonment by killing our holder." Issei didn't know how to feel about the use of the plural in Dante's words, as if he was through what Issei had been, but he didn't care enough for it to derail the entire interaction once more. "Who are you associated with?" Nobody, the awakening of my master's power was what allowed us to escape the grasp of our captor, before that we had no interaction with the supernatural. At that, the humanoid's eyes widened a slight bit and wandered more towards Issei, who unsurprisingly avoided making eye contact. So I am the first supernatural being you two have encountered. Yes. In actuality, that was a lie, but Dante didn't want to reveal the Phoenix's vessel circle just like that. I see. Well, I think I should at least introduce myself. I go by Tiamat, the Dragon Queen of Chaos. Dante barely managed to hide his relief. If they were to have continued fighting, she might have felt the need to use her flames. And from what little he knew about them, he was sure that the use of her flames would be catastrophic for both him and Issei. For one, they might have been able to actually kill Issei, as he had yet to fully embrace the Phoenix's powers. And even if not, the literally chaotic effect those flames would have inflicted on not only Dante, but also Issei would have spelled certain doom for them. I am here as I felt a powerful dragon being birthed right here. And from what you are saying, I feel that I was right with my previous assumption that your master is said dragon. Dante blinked in utter confusion. What? The Phoenix was no dragon. Sure, it was an immortal eternal which was born out of pure energy, but it was not a dragon. Of course, it was easily excusable for someone to make such a misconception, but this was not just someone making a random assumption from minimal knowledge they had garnered of the Phoenix. No. This was one of the most powerful dragons, stating that the Phoenix was one of its kind. Dragons were rather unique beings as they seemingly could recognize members of their species without the need of a second glance, even if those members were trapped within sacred gears or other such contraptions. Dante paused. In his inner monologue, he had never grasped the idea of checking if Issei was in possession of a sacred gear or such. So he decided now would be the best time for exactly that. Briefly closing his eyes, he let his inner view wander through the connection to his master and stare into him. There was a blindfolded boy. Upon the boy, a spotlight shone. Surrounding the boy was a ring of white fire. But around them was darkness. And when Dante stared into that darkness, it stared back. Not a second later it felt like doors were shut before him and he blinked a bit in confusion, finding himself back with Tiamat and Issei in the forest. The former having a brow raised at him. Before she could say anything, he closed his eyes again trying to take another look at what he had seen within Issei, but it felt like trying to break an iron vault with nothing but a branch. He couldn't get the slightest peek of what was happening within Issei. It worried him, but right now there were more urgent matters at hand. Yeah, that must be the case. Tiamat remained silent. Her expression clearly showed that she had not expected such uncertainty from Dante, but she left it uncommented. Well, I will be going now. The gate that had brought her to the forest previously manifested once more, this time right behind her. Once more Issei witnessed the magical spectacle, wondering how one could control such radical and chaotic power. Tiamat remained unbothered by neither Dante or Issei as she stepped into the portal but paused before fully disappearing through it. Oh, and also. The tension in the air suddenly grew thicker than ever before during the entire confrontation, a bloodlust shining in her sapphire eyes that promised pain and despair as she turned toward the two. Try removing it and you will pay with your blood. Not letting the two react to her statement, she fully emerged into the portal, leaving them behind within the forest. Issei instantly calmed as the threatening presence of the Dragon Queen dissipated and sat down to rest his body for a bit until Dante would tell him what they were to do next. Dante on the other hand was completely entranced by those last words. Removing what? Why was it so important to her? What actions were considered removal? They had been warned, so much was for sure, but it had been in such loose terms that it could have been literally anything they had on their person as of that moment. Though Dante highly doubted that the Dragon Queen would mind them changing their clothes. Actually, now that Dante thought about it, Issei's clothes weren't truly on him, they were part of him, after all. He had regenerated into the being that he had seen himself as, and with Issei's imagination being rivaled by that of a rock, he had imagined himself as exactly who he had been before death. And while this could be written off as body positivity by anyone who didn't know about Issei's state of mind, it was ridiculous that Issei had considered his clothes to be part of himself for some absurd reason. At least that was how Dante viewed it. In truth, Issei had just subconsciously known that being naked would go against his point of remaining outside of any spotlight that might bring danger with it, and so he had just considered them something to have always by him, to remain as unnoticeable as ever. This simply resulted in the clothes born from his flames becoming part of his body, but he didn't really consider anyone taking note of such, so he didn't mind it. Dante, stopping himself from worrying too much about something he could do nothing about, decided that shelter was their next goal. Having sensed rather strong demonic presences within the city when they had departed from it, he turned to the only place that gave off holy energy. The abandoned church. There were two churches in Kuo. One was positioned smack center of Kuo, next to a mall. With it being such a centerpiece of the town, it was upheld thoroughly, even with Kuo itself being very non-Christian. The other one wasn't that lucky. It was on the outskirts of the town and significantly smaller, which made it irrelevant for most residents. If anyone was Christian, they'd simply go to the central church, leaving this one to rot away for ages. But even so, the holy energy within it was still potent enough to be felt by any supernatural being. Churches, being literal hotspots for holy energy, kept their natural energy even decades after being abandoned. The whole reason for being built was to get closer to the god of the respective religion. Some were naturally more potent than others. A church like the Sagrada Familia would be radiating enough holy energy to evaporate low-power stray devils for centuries if it ever were to be abandoned. But this wasn't the Sagrada Familia, this was some tiny old church on the edge of a town that was considered very non-Christian within a country that in itself was rather non-Christian. And even so one could feel the slight air of holy energy when close to it. At least Issei thought it was holy energy. He was unfamiliar with it, his mother had no ties to religion in any way, especially Christianity. So he had never been to either of the churches, but even so, the state of the building was odd. It seemed to not be old enough to be considered a relic of its time, with no plants growing high on its walls, no fallen walls or anything like that, yet when they entered it looked like the place had been ripped apart. Benches lay everywhere broken into pieces, the altar itself was but a pile of burned wood, any holy symbols were nothing more than rubble, and the basement door led into a room that was littered with burn marks. And most notably, the holy energy inside had been almost completely dismissed, making the one outside more potent. A battle has occurred here. Dante's words were satisfactory in explaining the state of the building, but they only opened up questions about said battle. Who? Why? When? And most importantly for Issei. How? While knowing the fighters, motivations, and time was all very valuable information, for Issei the most interesting part was how the battle was fought. What powers did the combatants have? Had they been on equal footing or had it been a one-sided slaughter? How did they burn the inside in such a manner? What was powering them and how powerful did it make them? So many questions, yet all of them were out of reach. Issei had no method of tracking the fighters down and observing them, nor did he believe that all of them were still alive. Judging by how the former battlefield looked, the battle was won to the death. Of course, that assumption could be complete garbage, after all, every battlefield he had entered was one ruled by guns and bullets, where the fighting was over within a single second, and the results were decided by the pull of a single trigger. This had been something else. Said burn marks were scattered everywhere. Painting not only the floor but also the walls and pillars, some even on the roof of the room. There was no decipherable pattern to them, they were laid out in a chaotic dance of battle. A dance Issei was unfamiliar with and which he could not follow by simply viewing the scars it left behind. But in the end, it didn't matter. What they had been looking for was a place where they would be safe from the devil's eyes, and if this building had already been cleaned out, that meant that they most likely wouldn't check back again anytime soon. At least that was what Dante seemed to count on, as he was already collecting the usable pillows of the shattered benches to form something distantly resembling a bed. To be fair, it wasn't like they had much more other options. Dante had chosen the spot, so he couldn't know of any safer spot, and Issei was simply unfamiliar, not only with the supernatural, but with Kuo itself, having spent most of his life either within his home or a place he had been forced to call such. It made him realize just how out of touch he was. Information was power. So much he had picked up on. After all, withholding it from him was part of what had kept him within the arms of his tormentor for so long. And now the fact that he had learned nothing other than killing over the last few years was a detrimental barrier he had to somehow overcome. For that reason, he was thankful to at least have Dante on his side. Dante wasn't by any means much, but he wasn't only ready to protect Issei with his life, but he also had at least some information on this world and was capable of simple communication, two skills Issei thoroughly lacked in. And he could be trusted. If it wasn't for Issei's very being trusting Dante, he would have by now pushed him away to stay as hidden as possible. But having this deep trust in him allowed Issei to stay around the man with his guard fully lowered. At first, it had scared him a bit, after all, he had never seen this guy in his life before, and suddenly his instincts forced him to trust Dante without a second thought. Of course, Dante had explained to him just why that was the case, but even so, it took Issei a bit to get used to the feeling. It felt oddly relieving to have someone that he knew would never leave his side. We should rest. Issei turned to Dante, his eyes still as observant and mute as they had been before. Your body does not need rest anymore, but your mind might need it for the next few years. It takes a bit for you to get used to abandoning sleep, and we don't want you driving yourself insane by losing sleep. Issei didn't see a problem with that, of course, the reveal that he didn't need sleep immediately made him want to constantly stay awake for the sake of being alert at all times, but at the same time, he felt himself start craving for a rest. A lot had happened to him within the last few hours, and taking a break from all that was just what he needed. He looked past Dante, at the makeshift bed the man had made. It wasn't much, but it would do. But before he went to rest for the night, he gave Dante another glance. I won't be sleeping, my need for it has been no more for millennia by now. Issei felt a bit of envy at that, but decided that by what Dante was saying, he would also at some point reach that point of no sleep. Being envious of something he'd acquire anyway seemed pointless to him, so he didn't bother and just plumped himself on the scrap-made bed, surprised at how comfortable it felt. Dante didn't simply guard Issei for the remainder of the night while his master was sleeping, he made sure to hide the entrance to the underground area once more, lowering the chances of them being caught by anything. But unfortunate for Issei, his sleep wouldn't be a simple rest. He found himself in a field. A burning field. Red flames devoured every tiny part of the grassland, with few patches untouched by the raging flames. He started walking through it. Never stepping into the fire as he smoothly slid through the fields. The shadow covered him and he looked upward. The sky was hidden behind a wall of black clouds, a red glow sometimes peeking through them as a massive black shadow made its way through it. He watched as the titanic being flew past over him at a speed unfathomable for a creature of such size. And then he chased after it. He ran towards the infinite horizon, the red flames lashing out at him, but never able to grasp him, as he ran and ran. After an eternity of running, he was at the edge, an edge that led into a void of infinite darkness, and without any hesitation, Issei jumped down towards it. As he fell through the void, white flames started falling from above, downward into the infinite darkness, and as he stared down into it stared back. Issei woke up by himself. He found himself in the basement of the church again and quickly spotted Dante, leaning up against a pillar. The dream he had was already fading away. He sat up and thought about what to do. What was there to do? He had a spot that was presumably safe, he didn't need food, and soon sleep would also be something of the past. There wasn't really anything that he could do more. The memory of the encounter with Tiamat flashed before his eyes. He had been easily outmatched by her. At no point in their confrontation did he and Dante even have a sliver of the upper hand. If the Dragon Queen would have been less curious and more hostile, he was sure they'd be dead by now. Issei looked within himself. He felt himself and a warm fire wrapping around his being. There were some other things he could feel, but he didn't give them any thought, focusing on the flames around his being. They were the phoenix, the being that had offered him immortality. But for them to achieve such they had to become one, there shouldn't be a flame around him, it should be part of him. Just how would he achieve such? There are many ways to increase your bond with the phoenix. Issei opened his eyes to be faced with Dante. It was a bit uncanny how the man could sometimes read him like an open book, but at the same time, he was thankful that he didn't have to talk back. Currently it's more like you're two separate beings, held together by a contract. You can tap into the phoenix powers and in exchange your body is a vessel. But we are gonna work on changing that. After all, you aren't supposed to be just a vessel. Dante stood up, manifesting the same side he brought forth in the encounter with Tiamat. Now, as I said, there are many ways to increase that bond. The most simple method is meditation, but I honestly doubt you are capable of such with your current state of mind. He took on a battle stance, letting Issei get off the makeshift bed as the boy shifted a bit himself, taking on what distantly resembled a defensive stance. But what I think will work most is the brute force method, forcing your body and mind into a situation where it has to synchronize with the phoenix to get out of them. Dante swung down the side at Issei, who jumped to the side, narrowly avoiding the glowing blade as he could feel the warmth radiating from it. Not giving Issei much room to breathe, Dante swung the scythe sideways at him, forcing Issei to drop to the ground, but he wasn't trained in any form of combat, so instead of taking a position from which he could immediately move again, he practically immobilized himself by dropping down onto his back, giving Dante a huge opening. The older man did not hesitate as he launched another attack at the boy, one that would in most fights qualify as a killing blow, but Issei refused to let this end so quickly. He reached again within himself and tried calling upon the flames by his side. He felt a warmth fill his body, but before much more could happen the scythe went straight through his dot. He had been too slow. But the battle wasn't over yet. A hit like that would not be enough to put him out of commission. White flames enveloped his body and exploded outward from him, but as he saw Dante shake his head in dismay, he knew that there was something flawed with his approach. You unleash the flames unfocused, more powerful enemies require you to attack them more focused. A hailstorm won't penetrate a tank, a cannonball has higher chances. But those words, Issei was flung across the room and into a pillar, the flames that had started forming around him dispersing, leaving only some behind on his own body, which quickly healed the wounds caused by the attack. Issei was quick to note that these flames weren't even close to as potent as those he used against the man were, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why that was the case. The first attempt at following Dante's advice failed horribly. Instead of controlling the white flames, he simply unleashed them again, having no control over them as they simply spread across the floor, uncaring for his goal. In the meantime, Dante was approaching rapidly, ready to strike once more. Issei, feeling backed up into a corner, tried throwing off Dante by dashing forward. It was useless, as Dante simply corrected his movement a bit and already got another hit in. Once more Issei flew across the room, hitting a wall. Why could he not get the flames to obey him? He knew why. It was because it wasn't necessary for his survival. There was no benefit in doing this, maybe even a drawback, as he would potentially draw more attention by having more control over his powers. No. That wasn't true. Dante dashed towards Issei once more, ready as ever to deliver another strike. If Issei wanted to survive in this cruel world, he'd have to be powerful enough to defend himself, and if someone directly under his command could easily beat him to a pulp, anyone could. There were beings out there like Tiamat, far superior to him and Dante, and if he ever wished to come out alive in an encounter with such beings, he would need to be able to defend himself. Survival was his goal, his destiny. Dante attacked. And if he had to become stronger for it, there would be nothing stopping him. Before the glowing blade could reach Issei, white flames exploded from his body, far more potent than in the prior attempts. They enveloped his right arm completely as he punched. With his swing, he hit the blade, redirecting the momentum of the attack and forcing Dante to pull back and reposition. But doing so gave Issei a window of opportunity. As Dante was making the distance between himself and Issei, the white flames jumped forward, shooting toward Dante like arrows. But the scythe wielder was not one to easily buckle, blocking the flames with his scythe before readjusting his stance, facing Issei in a standoff, as the younger one was glowing with his flames surrounding his body. Issei took a deep breath, feeling the fire, feeling the phoenix, as it moved with him. It was like an extension of himself, a limb so infinitely versatile yet so new and foreign to him. He needed to become one with it. He needed to move it like it was a part of him. Currently the flames simply stuck to his movement. If he punched, they follow his motion, but he couldn't properly move them without moving his own body. Another deep breath. This time he initiated the attack, dashing forward, his arms enveloping in the white flames as he prepared to strike Dante. The older man, in response, shifted into a more defensive stance. Issei didn't know, but Dante saw thousands of openings in Issei's attack but refused to take any of them, deciding that they'd get there once Issei got a better grasp of his powers. And Issei was far from having a grasp on the basics of anything really. His punches were sloppy, simply flying fists, leaving him wide open and showing no technique in them. His movement was basic, with no minimizing of unnecessary actions and no prioritizing of positioning. The only reason he would beat most normal humans was the flames, but even so, someone who knew how to fight could still easily dodge and block his advances while knocking him out without much trouble. What Issei wasn't lacking in was spirit or vigor, dashing at Dante like a beast having spotted its prey, and even though Dante knew that Issei wouldn't kill or even harm him, it still felt intimidating facing him. Issei's first punch was dodged by Dante. The second one as well. The third was blocked. The fourth dodged. 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 Blocked. Dodged. Blocked. Blocked. Countered. Once more Issei was flung across the room, hitting his head again against a pillar and having the flames heal him once more. He couldn't lose this. Not if he wanted to be strong. Not if he wanted to survive. Not if he wasn't weak. Something about the air in the room changed immediately as Issei stood back up, the flames raging more potently than before, wrapping more and more around his body. But it wasn't just that, Dante felt like Issei had changed right in front of him. As Issei stood up, he immediately fell into a stance, one unfamiliar to Dante. And then he moved. It was like watching a tiger force its prey into a corner, each movement lowering the distance between himself and Dante. Dante didn't allow himself to get intimidated, standing his ground as he prepared for whatever Issei was about to unleash on him. Once Issei got within a certain range of Dante, he punched the air toward his opponent, unleashing a small fireball from the swing, which the older man easily deflected using his scythe. But the second his scythe was preoccupied with the fireball, Issei was upon him, a fire unlike anything he had shown before in his eyes. Dante was completely taken aback by the sudden burst of speed by Issei, taking a flaming fist straight to the dot. The force behind it was unexpected, many times stronger than Issei's other punches. Dante, not unlike Issei, was sent flying through the room. He used his scythe as a hook, slamming it into the floor. As he looked up, Issei wasn't in his line of sight. Before he could do anything, a hit from above sent his head into the ground, and right after he felt Issei grab him by the legs, and Dante was again thrown across the room like a rag doll. Dante was perplexed by where this newfound power of Issei came from, but even he didn't know where he had pulled these instincts from. As Issei had looked back into himself, he had suddenly stumbled over something different, something else within him. Something that wasn't the phoenix. And as he tapped into it, he suddenly felt his body move almost on its own. The only negative side effect of using it was that his bloodlust was hitting new highs. With every second in this state of combat, he could feel his need for violence increase. Multiple times already he had caught himself thinking about how Dante's blood would taste, knowing full well that Dante's body, like his own, didn't contain any blood. Issei decided that he didn't like the pace at which these thoughts were popping up and pushed whatever he had tapped into back into his subconscious. It didn't give up without a fight, but ultimately his conscious was far more potent than whatever it was, easily pushing it back. His feral stance dropped, the menacing air dissipated, and the raging flames faded away. Dante had already recovered from being thrown around and eyed his master with a bit of worry. What exactly was that? Issei looked down at his own hands. An excellent question, he realized. In the heat of battle, he had completely neglected asking himself such, but now that it was pointed out to him, he grasped that whatever it was that had come over him was completely unfamiliar to him. No, that was a lie, it didn't feel foreign, he knew of it somehow, but his mind just couldn't decide from where or how. Nonetheless, it was something he should keep an eye on, after all, it had made him think in ways that were rather unsettling to him. Yet he could not deny that the benefits it had brought him had been massive. The instincts were the sole reason he had been able to overpower Dante, but he wasn't sure if they were worth using with the cost attached to them. He was giving it too much thought. It wasn't potent enough for him to actively need to suppress it, which made it too little of a threat for him to worry about. Was it what Tiamat had mentioned? Was this thing, this existence within him, what the Dragon Queen had referred to when she had threatened the both of them? Maybe, he had no way to tell. After all, she had left without any more context and without a way for them to contact her. For them to communicate, she had to reach out to them of her own volition, if she even could reach them right now. Well, I suppose, asking you questions to which you don't know the answer is useless. Issei agreed silently, but still, even if they aren't answered immediately, putting such questions at least into the room could be of great value later down the line. No matter, you made progress. You are starting to get a grip over the Phoenix's powers, but before you go on improving those, I'd suggest we work on your general combat skill. Looking up from his palms, Issei looked at Dante, interested as to what the man was to teach him. I don't know how aware you are of this, but before you activated whatever that was, your movements were sloppy at best. Everything from your positioning to your attacks has a lot of room for improvement. Trust me, a fighter that knows what they're doing can beat opponents double their strength. Once again Issei put his entire trust into the man. He didn't know anything about physical combat. Never had he heard of martial arts, and punching also really wasn't his strong suit. After all, each of his kills with a single exception had come from him shooting people. But he didn't have that gun anymore. Maybe if he returned to the place where he had murdered the man he could find it again, but such efforts were unlikely to result in anything of value. So, he had nothing better to do but to clench his fist and do as Dante told him to do. Dante wasn't the best teacher. While he and Issei shared a kind of bond that allowed them to understand one another on a certain level, Dante still had trouble conveying certain information to Issei. Many of the basics he had already completely internalized, and thus he sometimes completely forgot that Issei just didn't know certain basics yet. To his dismay, Issei was, expectedly, not much of a cooperative student, but at least he never complained and was determined to keep going even after falling flat on his face. This drive was what allowed them to make quite some progress even within the first day of training. It wasn't much, but any progress was still progress, and no one ever claimed that the road to success would be easy or quick. At least they weren't on a time limit or anything allowing them to train without interruption for as long as they needed. That much they thought. The Grimoire mansion is one of gigantic magnitude. Multiple palaces and mansions from the human world would fit within it without the slightest problem. Yet even with such a ridiculous size it was kept better than most if not all of those comparatively small buildings, as what was keeping it in such pristine condition was not a hardworking group of individuals, but rather magic. The Grimoires, with their pillar ability to have unusually big supplies of magical energy, could easily put large amounts into runes or magical circles for them to maintain a building of such size for hundreds of years without needing to be recharged. Yet with such a size came the factor that many corridors and rooms of the mansion were empty, having been in such a state for multiple years. Even with the Grimoire pillar being such a powerful one, they just didn't have enough to fill out the megastructure they called their home. Some would call it a waste of space, and while such an argument could not easily be dispelled, Sirzich's was rather thankful for this. The Saten Lucifer stood in one of said empty rooms, looking out the window and watching one of the inner circles of his family's country-sized territory. It was the most prestigious, ignoring the mansion itself, housing all of the servants that were considered high enough up the ladder to be living close to their rulers, but not high enough to be right next to them. It was a whole city really, one functioning in a very interesting communist-like way. The people living there didn't need currency for within the city, everything was given out to them simply for free, in return they were to give the Grimoire clan their services whenever they were called upon. Yet it still was somewhat autonomous. The city had a major, they had their own events and large parties. Everyone within the mansion had authority over them, but it was hardly felt within the city itself, as well there were a good 100 inhabitants within the Grimoire mansion, the city was close to tens of thousands in numbers. There were much bigger cities in the Grimoire territory. Hell, some of them, especially in the outskirts, were only inhabited by people not associated with the Grimoire clan, with only the stores, banks, and other such buildings being run by the pillar. A good portion of pillars had such areas, especially for low-class devils, that didn't have ties to any bigger faction within devil society. Sometimes Serziches wondered what the life of a low class would be like. He had been born with both the clan trades of his mother and father, and as the heir of his territory, later on taking the position of Lucifer. The Grimoire pillar was one of the least affected by the Devil Civil War, allowing for their recovery to be swift. The closest he probably got to feeling like a low class was during the war itself, but even then he had been seen as one of the most critical pieces on the side of the anti-Satan faction and treated with according respect. Poverty was almost a mystery to him, only knowing of it in concept and hearing of it as the leader of the Devil Society. He didn't feel any desire to experience it, but sometimes he just pondered. On the fourth day, a nasty surprise would come for them. It was the first night where Issei had refused to sleep, and to Dante's surprise, he seemed to be pulling through pretty well, having been able to keep training for the remaining hours of the night and into the morning. Then someone came into the basement. Neither Dante nor Issei had the time to react as a man appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He had a massive frame towering over both of them at something around 2 meters. He was dressed in a simple black business suit, his brown hair could be less described as hair and more like a lion's mane. He looked surprised by their presence within the church, but not particularly bothered. "Who might the two of you be?" His voice demanded respect, and as he spoke he adjusted one of his white gloves. Dante felt frustrated at being unable to recognize this man. It was like with Tiamat, he had no gaze on how powerful they were or what their intent was. Issei on the other hand immediately knew that he didn't like the man. He gave off a certain aura, one somewhat reminiscent of the man he had murdered. And even though the similarities were small, they were enough for Issei to categorize the man. "We wish no trouble." Dante's words were contradicted by the killing intent Issei was radiating. But even so, the man remained seemingly unbothered. "I never was a questions guy." He cracked his knuckles. "Let's do this the hard way." Issei felt his entire body ripple in pain. His bones shattered into tiny crumbs, his insides exploding. The next moment his legs gave in, making him fall onto his knees and hands. Through the pain, he heard a thump echo through the room, another impact of the devastating fist, this time against Dante, before the powerful man sighed. "I overestimated you too, at least those didn't kill you." Issei felt his hatred ignite. He had taken so much pain, so much punishment, and after finally escaping he would be pushed back into a corner again. No, not him, never him, he would rise above it, rise higher until nothing could reach him. White flames burst from his body, spreading within moments covering the entire room in the fire. He would become the hunter. "Ah, so you aren't done yet." Issei looked up, before him the towering man stood. His flames encircled the man's legs, trying to burn him down, but simply failing. The man stood, unbothered by them, his arms crossed as he merely looked down at Issei. "Come on, I don't have all day." Allowing himself to tap back into his hate, the instincts kicked in, immediately catapulting him forward toward the titan of a man. He was ready to rip him into bits and pieces. Instead, another wave of pain. Even with his instincts going overdrive, he didn't even see the man move, being struck down in an instant. "Wow, for the little power you are displaying, you are resilient." Another ripple of pain. Issei felt himself gasp for air, even without needing any. His human instincts were stopping him, were halting his progress. Really resilient. The next punch was way stronger than any before, Issei's limbs being torn off his body as the fist impacted with his center of mass. Pain reeled within his mind, washing out any thoughts. Yet Issei refused. He refused to give in. Refused to give up. He arose, his limbs reattaching to his body as his eyes gave off a bright glow. He was ready to fight. "This is starting to get on my nerves." Once more a wave of utter pain rippled through his body. But he kept standing. Refusing to buckle. Refusing to kneel. He took the attack and kept staring at the man, who now stood right in front of him, his fist buried in Issei's dot. But the man didn't stop there. Another fist to the dot. Issei felt his body jerk back a bit at the sheer force, but he stood his ground. He refused to fall. Another. Issei stood. Another. He. Another. Would. Another. Another. Not. Another. 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 Fall. That's it. The man took a step back, his hand getting covered in dark energy, with red sparks flying off of it. At the sight of it, Issei immediately felt alarm bells going off in his head. But he dismissed them. He had stood against the previous punches, this one would not force him back down. No longer. Instead, he would be the one attacking. Would he be prey? Like against his former tormentor, Issei let the flames envelop his entire arm. They burned with power, ready to be unleashed on his opponent. Doing what he remembers Dante teaching him, he turned with his punch, using his entire body to catapult the fist forward towards his opponent, with the intent of ripping a hole into them as he did to his last opponent. It failed miserably. Issei didn't even see it happen. From one moment to another, his arm and shoulder were simply gone, turned into nothing. Before he could even form a thought, the pain came down on him. And it drowned his mind. Unlike before, the pain was not just physical, instead, it felt like his very being had been the target. Not a second later he was unconscious, his mind simply not able to withstand the sheer pain. Failure. Tiamat had shown him that he was far from the strongest, and the towering man had beaten that lesson into him. This world was cruel. It wouldn't show him forgiveness. This had been the sole exception. The only one. Only today he would be able to live after failure. Never again. If he wanted to survive, he had to prove to it that he was willing to push through all its gruesome trials. Whatever would be put between him and survival. It would burn. Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow the TaskFailer for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.